Even Clint Eastwood makes mistakes, folks. When the man who played Dirty Harry admits he's bought some real lemons over the years, you know this is going to be good. Today, we're looking at 17 cars that even made the man with no name wince. From a '74 Mustang II that he calls Ford's biggest crime against humanity, to a Chrysler Imperial that cost more to fix than he paid for his first house. These are the worst American cars that somehow ended up in Eastwood's garage. And wait until you see number 5. It's a prototype that Detroit tried to bury, and now Clint says he knows exactly why they wanted to keep it hidden. Number 17. 1974 Ford Mustang II Ghia. Let's start with what Clint calls the car that made the Pinto look good. Back when the oil crisis hit, Ford thought they could save the Mustang's reputation by building what amounts to a Pinto in a fancy suit. Eastwood bought this one because, as he puts it, sometimes you need a reminder that even great companies can completely lose their minds. Under that long hood sits the most disappointing V8 in Mustang history, 302 cubic inches, making an embarrassing 140 horsepower. That's less power than a modern Toyota Corolla, folks. The Ghia package added fake wood trim, crushed velour seats, and what Clint describes as enough chrome to blind pilots flying overhead. The problem started on day one. The car came with what Ford called refined suspension, which Eastwood says means it handles like a drunk elephant on roller skates. The transmission has 2 modes, either not shifting at all or shifting so hard you need a neck brace. The build quality was so bad, he jokes that the panel gaps are measured in inches rather than millimeters. Number 16. 1976 Chrysler Imperial LeBaron. Here's what happens when you try to out-luxury Cadillac with a budget that wouldn't cover lunch. This Imperial cost more than a Cadillac when new, but had build quality that would embarrass a kit car manufacturer. Clint found this one at an estate sale, complete with every option, including the notorious dual comfort air conditioning that never worked on either side. Under that endless hood sits Chrysler's 440 cubic inch V8, an engine that somehow manages to make 225 horsepower feel like 100. The 3-speed torque flight transmission, usually bulletproof in other Chryslers, seems to have been assembled by blindfolded mechanics in this car. Eastwood says it shifts like somebody's dropping bowling balls down a flight of stairs. The real problems, though, are in the details. The power windows need power window fluid. Yes, that's actually what Chrysler called it, and it's been out of production since Carter was president. The leather seats were apparently made from whatever animals lost fights that week, with stitching that started unraveling before the first oil change. The dashboard has more fake wood than a Hollywood Western set, and it warps if you look at it funny. Clint keeps this car around for 2 reasons. First, it's a perfect example of why Chrysler needed a government bailout a few years later, and second, he uses it to store parts for his other cars. The trunk is so huge, he says it's like having a mobile garage. Number 15. 1980 Cadillac Seville Bustleback. Here's what Clint calls GM's attempt to make a Rolls-Royce after drinking too much bourbon. This Seville represents everything wrong with American luxury cars in the 1980s, trying to look expensive while cutting every possible corner underneath. The 368 V8 diesel engine is what Eastwood describes as GM's worst idea since the Corvair, making a pathetic 105 horsepower from 6.0 liters. It had a nasty habit of self-destructing at around 30,000 miles. This particular car has gone through 3 engines, and that's considered lucky for these diesels. The transmission is equally tragic, with shifts so harsh, Clint says it feels like you're being rear-ended at every gear change. But the real crime is that styling. GM spent millions trying to convince people that the trunk looking like it was installed backward was actually elegant. The vinyl roof was standard equipment, probably to hide the rust that started forming before the car left the showroom. Inside, the fake wood trim started peeling off during the test drive. Number 14. 1977 Lincoln Versailles. Talk about putting lipstick on a pig. This is what happens when you take a Ford Grenada, triple the price, and hope nobody notices. Lincoln actually had the nerve to compare this to Mercedes-Benz in their ads. Clint keeps it as what he calls a monument to corporate delusion. Under that padded vinyl roof, which holds moisture about like a sponge, sits a 302 V8 making a whopping 135 horsepower. The transmission has what Lincoln called refined shifting logic, which Eastwood translate as it shifts whenever it feels like it, usually at the worst possible moment. The power windows have 2 speeds, slow and slower, assuming they work at all. But here's the real kicker: Lincoln's attempt at European-style handling. They installed a suspension system that manages to combine the worst aspects of both American and European cars. It floats like a Cadillac over big bumps, but crashes like a sports car over small ones. Clint says it's the only car he's owned that can make you seasick and shake your fillings loose at the same time. Number 13, 1982 Cadillac Cimarron. If you want to know exactly when Cadillac lost its way, this is it. Clint calls this the car that proved somebody at GM was clearly having a nervous breakdown. It's basically a Chevrolet Cavalier wearing a Cadillac badge and price tag. Imagine putting a Rolex logo on a Timex and charging Rolex prices. Under the hood lurks a 2.0-liter 4-cylinder engine making an embarrassing 88 horsepower in a Cadillac. Eastwood says it's the only Cadillac in history that could get passed by a riding lawnmower. The manual transmission, which nobody ordered because it was a Cadillac, was actually the better choice. The automatic transmission had shift timing that Clint describes as purely theoretical. The interior, though, is where the real comedy happens. Cadillac took Cavalier-grade materials and tried to make them look luxurious by adding leather seats thinner than a fast food napkin and enough fake wood to build a tree house. The dashboard is pure Chevrolet, just with different badges and a $5,000 markup. Even the key is the same as the Cavalier's. They didn't even bother with a unique Cadillac key. Number 12, 1975 AMC Pacer. Here's what happens when you design a car by committee while the committee is having an acid flashback. Clint bought this Pacer because, as he puts it, sometimes you need something in your garage to make everything else look better by comparison. The fishbowl styling makes it look like George Jetson's washing machine. But that's not even the worst part. The asymmetrical doors, longer on the passenger side, were supposed to be innovative, but mainly succeeded in confusing parking lot attendants. The huge glass area turns the interior into a greenhouse. Eastwood says you can actually grow tomatoes on the dashboard during summer. But the real entertainment comes from the luxury features. The air conditioning system requires sacrificial offerings to work properly. The radio antenna is mounted in the windshield, which means you lose reception every time you use the wipers. The spare tire is mounted under the hood, right next to the engine, so it's preheated for your convenience. Number 11, 1974 Lincoln Continental Mark IV. Now, here's what Clint calls the car that single-handedly kept the Arab oil industry in business. This land yacht is so massive it has its own gravitational pull, and about as fuel efficient as a Sherman tank. The previous owner actually had to add a second mortgage to his house just to keep it fueled during the oil crisis. Under that aircraft carrier-length hood sits a 460 cubic inch V8 that somehow manages to turn 7.5 liters of displacement into a wheezing 208 horsepower. The carburetor has more vacuum lines than a janitor's closet, and if any one of them cracks, which they all do, the car runs like it's burning coal. The transmission, when it does decide to shift, does so with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The luxury features are a testament to misplaced priorities. The opera windows are so small, they're practically useless, but Lincoln made sure to add little crowns that light up at night, because that's clearly what luxury car buyers needed. But here's where it gets really special: the electronics. The sequential turn signals have a mind of their own, sometimes blinking in Morse code. The climate control panel has more buttons than the Apollo spacecraft, but only manages 2 settings: Antarctic or Sahara. Number 10, 1981 Chrysler Imperial Frank Sinatra Edition. Now here's a car that proves even old blue eyes could make mistakes. Chrysler somehow convinced Frank Sinatra to put his name on what Clint describes as the most complicated way to turn gas into disappointment ever created. This technological nightmare came with a fuel-injected 318 V8 that made an underwhelming 140 horsepower and had more computing power than the first moon landing, none of which actually helped it run better. The electronic fuel injection system, which Chrysler bragged about endlessly, has more failure modes than a nuclear power plant. Clint says the check engine light is actually on more often than it's off. The interior is a tribute to early 80s excess. Every surface is covered in Mark Cross leather that's exactly the same shade of blue as Sinatra's eyes. At least that's what the brochure claimed. The seats have more buttons than a TV remote, controlling everything from lumbar support to what Chrysler called personalized comfort adjustments, but what Eastwood calls ways to get stuck in weird positions. The car came with a special Frank Sinatra cassette tape collection and a designer umbrella. Clint still has both. He says the umbrella works better than the car. The maintenance records include a note from a Chrysler technician that simply reads, "I quit." Number 9. 1976 Cadillac Eldorado convertible. Here's what happens when you combine the world's thirstiest engine with the world's least effective climate control system. This 8.2-liter monument to excess was supposed to be the last of the big American convertibles, which might explain why they apparently stopped caring about quality control entirely. The massive 500 cubic inch V8 makes 190 horsepower. Yes, you read that right. Somehow, Cadillac managed to get less power per cubic inch than a lawn tractor. The fuel economy is measured in gallons per mile, and the gas gauge moves so fast that you can actually watch it drop. Clint says filling it up is like pouring money directly onto the ground, just more expensive. But the real masterpiece is the electrical system. Lucas, the British company often called the Prince of Darkness, would look at this wiring and say, "That's a bit dodgy." The power windows have their own personality. Sometimes they all go down at once, sometimes they play tag, taking turns going up and down. The digital clock loses exactly 12 minutes per day unless it's raining, and then somehow it gains time. Number 8. 1980 Dodge St. Regis police package. Here's Chrysler's attempt to prove that you can make a police car by simply making a regular car worse. This was supposed to compete with a Ford LTD Crown Victoria, but Clint says it's more like a Crown Vic that's been in prison and came out angry. Under the hood sits a 360 cubic inch V8 that makes an unimpressive 155 horsepower while drinking premium gas like it's going out of style. The police package apparently meant heavy-duty everything, which translated to a suspension so stiff that it can shake fillings loose, brakes that either don't work at all or lock up completely, and a transmission that shifts like it's getting revenge for something. The interior is a masterpiece of cost-cutting. The seats are covered in something Dodge called heavy-duty vinyl, but what appears to be leftover material from making industrial floor mats. The dashboard is made of plastic so hard it could probably stop bullets, which is ironic for a police car. The radio has 2 settings, static and different static. Number 7. 1977 Mercury Cougar Brougham. Here's what happens when you take a Ford LTD, add every possible luxury option, and still somehow make it worse. Clint calls this the car that proves more is definitely less. This particular example has every option Mercury could think of, including what they called the Elite Luxury Decor Package, which apparently meant adding vinyl to everything that didn't move. The 400 cubic inch V8 somehow manages to make only 173 horsepower while using more gas than a small yacht. The carburetor has so many vacuum lines that the service manual includes a fold-out diagram bigger than a road map. The transmission, which Mercury proudly called Select Shift Cruise-O-Matic, has 3 speeds: slow, slower, and maybe eventually. But the real entertainment comes from the luxury features. The power seats move with all the speed of continental drift. The climate control panel has enough buttons to launch a space shuttle, but somehow still only produces 2 temperatures: Antarctica or Mercury surface. The power trunk closer has been known to trap small animals, leading to some interesting conversations with local wildlife control. Number 6. 1975 Oldsmobile Toronado. Here's what Clint calls GM's experiment in seeing how many things could go wrong with just one car. This front-wheel drive land yacht proves that sometimes innovation is just another word for new ways to break down. At nearly 5,000 pounds, It's got the mass of a small planet, but the structural integrity of a wet cardboard box. The 455 cubic inch V8 makes a disappointing 190 horsepower while consuming fuel like it's trying to drain the Middle East single-handedly. But that's not the real problem. It's how that power gets to the front wheels. The transmission is mounted alongside the engine, creating what Oldsmobile called unified power delivery, but what mechanics call impossible to work on. When something goes wrong, and it always does, you have to remove the entire front of the car just to reach it. The interior is a shrine to 1970s excess. Every surface is covered in either fake wood or crushed velour, and none of it has aged well. The power seats have enough motors to start a small robotics company, and when they fail, which they do spectacularly, you end up sitting at whatever random angle they decided to die in. But here's where it gets really special: the electrical system. This car has more vacuum-operated features at a space station, controlling everything from the headlight doors to the climate control. When one vacuum line fails, it sets off a chain reaction that Clint describes as like watching dominoes fall, but each domino costs $500 to fix. Number 5. 1982 Chrysler Imperial with electronic fuel injection. Here's the car that Clint says single-handedly kept electronics repair shops in business during the 1980s. This was Chrysler's attempt to combine traditional American luxury with cutting-edge technology, proving that sometimes two wrongs make an even bigger wrong. The fuel-injected 318 V8 was supposedly state-of-the-art, featuring what Chrysler called their electronic control module, but what mechanics called the reason I drink. It used a computer with less processing power than a modern calculator to control everything from fuel delivery to ignition timing. When it worked, it made 140 underwhelming horsepower. When it didn't, which was most of the time, it turned the car into the world's most expensive paperweight. The luxury features are a comedy of errors. The power seats have memory functions, but they've developed amnesia, and the automatic climate control has two settings: sauna and meat locker. Number 4. 1976 Cadillac Seville First Generation. Here's what happens when Cadillac tries to build a European-style luxury car while refusing to learn anything from the Europeans. Clint calls this GM's $3 billion mistake. That's what they spent developing what's essentially a Chevy Nova wearing a tuxedo that doesn't quite fit. Under the hood sits a fuel-injected Oldsmobile 350 V8 that makes 180 horsepower, unless the Bendix injection system is having one of its frequent mood swings. The fuel injection was so problematic that Cadillac dealers kept a stock of carbureted replacements in their back rooms. The interior is where Cadillac really showed their commitment to confusion. They combined traditional American luxury, meaning enough fake wood to build a cabin, with European-style instrumentation that nobody could read. The seats are covered in leather that Clint swears came from vinyl cows. But here's where it gets really special: the build quality. Cadillac changed Mercedes money for Chevrolet assembly standards. The panel gaps are so inconsistent that Clint says you could study chaos theory just by walking around the car. Number 3. 1974 AMC Matador Coupe. Here's what Clint calls proof that LSD made it into automobile design studios in the 70s. This car looks like it was styled by someone who'd never seen a car before, but had one described to them over a bad phone connection. AMC actually thought this would compete with a Ford Torino and Chrysler Cordoba. Talk about delusions of grandeur. The 401 cubic inch V8 in this beast makes 235 horsepower, all while drinking gas like a college freshman at their first party. The transmission, which AMC optimistically called Torque Command, has 3 speeds: eventually, maybe, and never. The power steering has so much play in it that Clint says you can turn the wheel 45 degrees before anything happens. Then everything happens at once. But the real masterpiece is the styling. The front end looks like it's trying to eat the road, while the rear quarter panels appear to have been designed by someone having an argument with geometry. The greenhouse is so large, it creates its own weather patterns inside the car, and the hood is so long and flat that Clint keeps a level on it just to show visitors it's actually horizontal. They never believe it at first glance. Number 2. 1978 Chrysler LeBaron Medallion Edition. Here's Chrysler's attempt to convince the world that a Dodge Aspen in a tuxedo was worth Mercedes money. Clint calls this the car that made Lee Iacocca's rescue job necessary. The Medallion Edition apparently meant adding every possible luxury feature while forgetting to make any of them work properly. Under the hood lurks a 318 V8 that somehow manages to make 120 horsepower disappear into thin air. The lean burn electronic ignition system, which Chrysler bragged about in every ad, is what mechanics call job security. It has more sensors than a space shuttle, and when one fails, which happens about as often as the sun rises, the car runs like it's burning coal instead of gasoline. But here's where it gets really special: the luxury features. The power windows have what Clint calls interpretive timing. Press the button, then wait anywhere from 2 to 20 seconds for something to happen. The vinyl roof is actually 3 separate pieces, creating what he calls as a water collection system more efficient than most irrigation networks. At number 1, 1977 Lincoln Continental Mark V Cartier Edition. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the heavyweight champion of automotive excess, what Clint calls the car that made OPEC rich. This land yacht is so massive it has its own gravitational pull, and the Cartier Edition apparently meant adding every possible luxury feature while doubling the probability of each one failing. Under that quarter-mile-long hood sits a 460 cubic inch V8 that turns dinosaur juice into disappointment with remarkable efficiency. Making 208 horsepower from 7.5 liters is the kind of math that only the 70s could produce. The carburetor is so complex that the manual recommends consulting an astrologer before making adjustments. The transmission, which Ford called Select Shift, has 3 speeds, all of them wrong. Clint keeps this car as what he calls a monument to excess. He says it's the perfect reminder of why the Japanese luxury brands took over in the 80s. The best part? He actually drives it to car shows, where it invariably breaks down in spectacular fashion, usually with all 4 power windows stuck in different positions. Well, folks, there you have it. 17 reminders that even great American car companies can completely lose their minds. From Cadillac's attempts to out-German the Germans to Chrysler's experiments in electronic self-destruction, these cars represent the darkest days of Detroit's history. The total maintenance cost on these 17 cars? Clint says he could have bought a small island for what he spent keeping them running. But as he likes to say, sometimes you need to preserve history, even if that history is trying to bankrupt you one vacuum line at a time. This is Vintage Vehicles, reminding you that sometimes the best stories in automotive history come from the cars that tried their hardest to kill the industry. We'll see you next time, folks, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to keep seeing America's most fascinating automotive failures.